listening to the Perspective podcast. This is a space for you who are longing to come back home, deeper into your own center and your own truth. This is a space for you who are longing to deepen the relationship to yourself and to others. My name is Madeleine Mofjärd, and in this space I invite you to explore conversations that in different ways touches upon the human experience. And I'm here to invite new perspectives. Hi, and welcome to the Perspective podcast.
Hello, and thanks for having me.
So beautiful to connect with you here today. I'm feeling so deeply inspired by your work at the moment. It feels so much like aligning with the processes that I am personally right now. So it's extra beautiful to have you on the show today. And I'm so curious to really like see where we get with this conversation and what will flow through us today. And so there's a lot of topics I would like to dive into with you, but before doing that, I would love to hear from you. How is your heart today? How is it to be Michaela today?
It's nice. Well, I was just telling you before we started, it's fall now. It's the first crisp day. I'm wearing a jumper in California. So, and it's gorgeous. It's just absolutely pristine light. And I got to spend the morning with my animals and in my garden, doing the opposite of planting. I was removing tomatoes for the winter. And so my heart is very happy. And I'm happy to be here, and I'll teach a bit later. And so it's a good day.
That's beautiful to hear. And I'm thinking that many people know about you. Many people in the audience are surely like very familiar with your work. But I'm also thinking that there might be people that aren't familiar with your work from before. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective. Is it something about you that you think that the audience would benefit, like knowing about you before we dive into the conversation? Is there anything that like this is good for them to know about you?
Oh God, I'm assuming you don't mean my bio.
Yeah,
Uh,
I will let them know that.
okay. Um, Well, I mean, the thing to know about me is I've been at this for a long time. I've been counseling and or teaching for 26 years now, and so I'm extremely passionate about it. It's really what I do. There's no real separation between my life out there and what I do here. So it's all one big exploration into, bringing the body into the world and bringing the body to relationship and all relationships, so meaning intimate and just in general. And so that's what I'm passionate about, and that includes nature, and it includes movement in the body, and it includes how we bring our entirety to any situation or any conversation. So that's really what I'm passionate about.
Mm, that's beautiful. And is there anything that you can like put the finger on that like made you end up on this path of doing this work that you're doing? Was there something like connected to your own relationship to yourself, or anything that made you feel intrigued to do this work that you're doing?
Well, I mean, there's hindsight, of course, right? I mean, in hindsight, I can see all the different aspects that led me to where I'm at. But of course, you don't know that when you're, a young girl. And I talk about this in my book. My career path, my chosen internal career path was I wanted to be a witch.
Mm,
Because I had read a bunch of books, and I had some really strong influences in my I grew up in Austria, so in a very kind of Celtic mystical area of Austria, near Salzburg. And so I kind of really wanted there to be like herbs and things growing and spells and ritual, and I didn't know what I was really asking for with 12, but that kind of was my first impetus to kind of go in the direction of where I'm at with nature and healing and herbs and potions and lotions and rituals and things like that. And so I'm very happy to have ended up where I'm at, because it's not that far off my career path.
Exactly, the relationship witch. Oh, that's beautiful. And so I'm curious to hear, you mentioned before that one of your like missions with your work is this deep like longing for helping people to have deeper relationships, right, with other people in intimacy, but also with themselves. And I'm curious to hear, is there any sort of like beliefs that you have, that you can see that you have changed in your personal like story connected to relationships, both when it comes to other people but also within yourself, like any ideas or truths that you've had to change when it comes to this area?
Oh yeah, I think I think this is a big topic, actually. I'm glad you're asking. This is a good question. I think if you're actually living, both living as a human, right, and living as a practitioner, you have to constantly revise your ideas of how it is. And some of that has to do with just maturing, personal maturation. Some of it has to do with how the world changes. And then some of that has to do with dogmas or societal beliefs that we all unknowingly are indoctrinated with, that you have to grow out of or mature out of. And so those three strands, when they're woven tightly together, can make for a very dogmatic and very rigid kind of belief. And then, of course, when I'm not talking about anyone specific, but you see that out there, right? When that kind of tightly held or tightly woven strand comes in contact with marketing, for instance, then sometimes people get really entrenched in ideas and beliefs that they are pushing on other people in their work and in their personal relationship, because it somehow validates their existence, right? So that's one way to look at it. And so, but if you don't hold these things so tightly, then of course your personal maturation, for anyone, makes it so that you realize some things about yourself, and your interactions with other humans, right? And then of course also, if we're really lucky, then we are allowed to change our mind on things as well, meaning we are given the space to say, well, I used to believe I'm this, but now I'm this, right? So if you have the right kind of environment, that growth and that changing of expression is allowed. And I was certainly lucky enough to have that happen. But also I would say that I've been actively working with people, like in close proximity with people for 26 years now. And that's very different than some people who, for instance, just do online coaching. They have a program. They never actually have to see the result of their work over a longer period of time, as it plays out in the real world. And when you do that, you get disabused of certain ideas or ideals very quickly, because just because I want it to be such does not mean that the couples or individuals sitting with me can take it or want it, or it is even right. So that's one of the big advantages of being in rooms with people, both, like one-on-one, even on Zoom, but, like over time, and teaching for so long, you get to actually see what holds and what doesn't hold. And that's very important, I think, to acknowledge that certain things don't hold anymore. And then the thing that I really also notice very much since I've started, I mean, you have to remember, I started seeing clients and teaching at a time where I would spend like an evening at home folding like pieces of paper into trifolds that I would stuff into envelopes and send out to announce a workshop, right? Or pin things onto bulletin boards. That's the kind of That's when I started out. So there was no social media. There was none of that. So the whole how we've kind of grown into certain things, both bad and good, and how the world has developed, both bad and good, makes it so that what was important to people back then is no longer important to people now. And while we still want intimacy and we still want the spark to stay alive in a relationship, and while we still basically want to love and want to be loved, everything else around that has changed so much that, of course, I really had to change as well, and my work had to change. And some of that was really pleasant because I could widen my experience of what I can do substantially. And some of it is also a bit incongruous because, of course, there's these prevailing strands of, let's say, pop culture psychology that make it very hard to work with people because they have so much preconceived notions. So, for instance, a good example of this is just one of many, is everybody and their dog knows about attachment theory now. And attachment theory is a good lens, but it's not a perfect lens, and it's not the only lens, and it's extremely reductive when it comes to things like trauma or familial imprints or intergenerational imprints or individuation. Like those kind of things don't fit into that lens. They shouldn't, right? That was one lens. It's a little bit like, yeah, well, I don't have to go any further into that. So my work had to change based on having to also take into account the prevailing fads, but also the incredible openings that have arrived in the last 20 years.
It's beautiful to hear you share, and I also really appreciate the perspective of like how everything cannot fit into just one lens or one perspective. We need all of these different lenses to view the world with and to view people with and ourselves. And so I think that's so valuable to hear you talk about that, because I think that's really something that I can see out there, that it's easy to sort of find one modality or one perspective and then only go for that. But I think it's so beautiful to open up for more, to invite more. And I think one of the things that I find so interesting with your work is the topic of embodiment, which I also attended a workshop with you maybe a week ago or something. And I think that's a topic that I really would like to bring to the audience for them to hear about. And so I'm curious if you would like to sort of talk to us about what embodiment means to you. What is embodiment from your perspective?
Yes. And the important piece here is to me, because of course everybody has a different idea, and so I can only talk about the way I work with it within my body of work, which I have a body of work around women's embodiment. I have a body of work that's more generally and has to do with trauma and going against freeze. And then, of course, there's the relationship aspect. And so the simplest way to look at embodiment is essentially the ability to listen to the messages of the body. And so that's a very different thing than essentially making it such that the body screams so loud that you can hear the messages. That's a very different approach, which some people do, and it's useful for them. So this is not a good, bad, it's an and kind of situation. So when we look at the fact that we have a body, we're always in our body till the day we die, but we're not always aware of our body or connected to the messages of the body. And so when we look at the body as a premier decision-making tool, which it is, right? So our bodies were keeping us alive and thriving and not only surviving, but thriving for millions of years before we had, this much brain available. And so because of that, there is an enormous genius in the body. And we have gotten used to ignoring that genius over, the cognitive aspects and also over the emotional aspects, where, the it's not the same. The messages of the body and the messages of the emotions are not exactly the same. They are connected, and of course the mind is connected to the emotions and the body, but they each bring a very specific wisdom and knowledge to life. And when we're not connected to the messages of the body, we're essentially ignoring a very, very vast capacity or resource within ourselves. And so, with that said, my work centers a lot around understanding what the body is good at and then giving the authority back to the body in those areas. And then with that, there is a kind of a trust that gets reestablished between the cognitive aspects of us, the emotional aspects, and the physical aspects, which leads to a very specific kind of nervous system relaxation that can only happen when those parts are integrated. Yeah. And that's how I look at embodiment. And there's many ways to go at it to get there.
Yeah, and I yes, exactly. There's many different layers to it, and I think it would be nice to hear you talk about like why living an embodied life, like what are the benefits that this sort of practice or lifestyle or integration in our bodies can give us. Like why should we sort of tap into embodiment practices for ourselves? And as I also know, there's mainly like women listening to this show, so maybe also if you could talk about like as women, why is this work extra important for us as women?
Yeah. Well, it is extra important for us, and there's reasons for that. I'll talk about generally, and that's why the first book I wrote, and I'm on the second one now, was for women, right? The Wild Woman's Way, specifically about that. How do you use everything that's available so that you can have everything you want within the context of your life, right? And not just one or the other. And so why? Well, I mean, I would say the first and foremost, before we even talk about personal experience or self-development, the first and foremost aspect is, of course, health. And that's very important to say, because if we are not connected to our body, we don't support ourselves with the health and well-being and vitality that's available to us. And furthermore, when we constantly engage in practices that go against the needs of our physical body, we can do quite a bit of damage, particularly in the realms of hormones, light exposure, sleep, sexual health and endocrine health. There's a lot of destruction that can happen when we are always up here in our head, in artificial light, on our computers. I mean, that's no news to anyone anymore, but it's important to say that of course has a health aspect to it. And so within that health context, before we even go in the other realms, for women, it's particularly important that we have a connection to the lower body aspects of our, existence, because of course that is where, from an endocrine perspective, it doesn't matter what orientation or identification you have. From an endocrine perspective, if you need a lot of energy and attention in your ovaries, in your uterus, for menstruation, for pregnancy, for birth, for the transition into menopause, all of these things require a lot of energy in the lower part of the body, just blood flow and proper functioning. And if things are very tight in the pelvic floor, that not only impedes blood flow, but it can cause pain and urinary tract situations and all of that, just from a purely bodily perspective. And so in women, that's of course much more pronounced, because there's so much more happening in that particular area internally, where the tension of muscles, the tightening of ligaments, the pulling up of energy, the kind of closure in the belly and the solar plexus really does a number on our health. So that's that, right? Then for humans in general, sedentary lifestyle, lots of, in the head stuff, all of that brings the energy up. And so when we look at, and this is very, very important, I can't say enough about this, because this takes it out of the esoteric, really, into real life, is when you look at how humans are built, we emit electrical energy in the cortex of the brain. That energy then runs our body as well as our cognitive function. We have a finite amount of energy available per second. We can't upgrade our RAM the way a computer can. So what that means is that the body is a genius of energy allocation, meaning the body pulls energy from where it's not needed and puts it where it's needed. So now, when you spend time like we're doing right now, seated, thinking, talking, thinking forward, keeping an eye on the time, like all these things that we do all the time, we need the energy here. And there's nothing wrong with that innately. It's just that whatever we do the most as humans becomes the predominant pattern. So not only are we pulling the energy up because we don't need much on the lower part of the body, we're parked in a chair, and that doesn't have to be a lot of energy or attention there. So the energy gets automatically pulled up, and then it's used here. But if you do this all the time, that automatic pull up becomes a pattern. So that's your go-to. And then, of course, if you have stress while you're doing this, this is not stressful, but there might be other situations that are stressful, or if you do too much of it, and you start having to clench to squeeze the energy up, or you're afraid, you hold your breath, or you sit funny, just by habit, you cross your legs, for instance. So now you're creating tension patterns. And also, if you really have to keep all the energy here, you're going to create tension patterns on your head, neck, and shoulders to keep the energy here. And then you have what many of us have, which is chronic tightness up here, chronic, obsessive thinking, overwhelm, overstimulation. Then you combine that with light exposure. I'm pointing at my damn ring light here.
I have one too. I have one too.
Well, you are in a part of the world where you do need to supplement in the winter. But that's a whole area of, if you can optimize light exposure, it supports your hormones so much. I can't even tell you about it. And I know that out of my own experience, because I had to really write my circadian rhythm after the pandemic, where I had to teach in the middle of the night because we could, we had stuff scheduled in Europe. So I would have to get up at midnight and, be on Zoom by 1 a.m. and stuff like that. So I had to really learn how to write that again. But so anyway, that is what happens, right? We have all this stuff happening here all the time. And then and with strong patterns, and I always joke that we're like the guys who go to the gym and they only work up the upper body, and then they have those spindly, tiny little legs and no butt. So, we're like that energetically often because we don't work the lower body system, the butt, the thighs, the pelvic floor, the sex organs. Energetically, we don't work that out as much as we work the other thing. So then when we do want to get into the realms where we require energy and attention and some patterns, intuition, boundary setting, pleasure, vitality, extra creative, everything that's traditionally related to the lower body, we don't have as much habit patterns there, or installed habits. And we also don't have as much capacity. And often we have, chronic tension patterns and things like that. So why do embodiment, and why do feminine embodiment, which is one aspect of embodiment, not all of it? Because if you can regularly access and train those patterns, then you can seamlessly go back and forth. You can be in your head, you can kick ass, you can do the things you want to do, and then you can get out of that and through fairly simple exercises like hip circles and things like that, and movement, come back into the body. lower body for what the lower body is good for. Also worth saying, coming back to general embodiment, the kind of sensations that make us be aware of the presence of our body sit in the lower body, in the solar plexus, in the belly, in the pelvic floor. Right? We have like a whole apparatus of feeling down there that's an intuitive, vital connection. And so when we are cut off from those parts about here, we miss that entire vast resource, and that's not good.
Yeah, and I know that there's a lot of people out there, both men and women, that has like this struggle of like opening up when it comes to intimate connections, right? Intimacy, due to like numbness or feeling empty or this freeze mode, right? So I'm curious to hear, do you have any like, if we could sort of bring it down a bit, like to make it more specific, like what are some specific sort of practices or things we could do with our bodies to open up or to leave freeze mode or to sort of work with this numbness that many people are experiencing, right?
Yeah, I mean, it always starts with ourselves. Obviously, it's important to say that because a lot of people want to abdicate their responsibility towards their own embodiment and put it on their partner and essentially go, you do me wrong, right? If you would know what you're doing, I wouldn't feel so numb. And that, of course, isn't the way it goes, right? It's there's a self-responsibility that might be a bit pesky, but it's also very empowering. And so, in general, it doesn't take much, interestingly enough, because we are built for it, right? Once again, these are things that are built into human survival. And our nervous system, has these two components that very much correlate to the two components that we like operate in. I call them go and flow. Often go meaning the getting things done, focused, like structured awareness, the ability to see things through, schedule things, plan ahead, give clean direction. All of that is in the go realm. And, anybody can be either good at that or bad at that. This is not some kind of gendered thing, even though it's often made into that. But that's yet another, tool of suppression, so to speak, if you equate that with genders, because it's both learned and also it's talents and gifts. But then there's the flow aspect, which is the essentially getting into the lower body, opening up, feeling things, and all of that. And so go and flow somewhat correlate with sympathetic, parasympathetic, in the sense that what makes us go into fight or flight, meaning into active defense, and then what makes us into, let's say, receptive, down regulating, what often is called, rest and digest or feed and breed. These two things work together the same way go and flow have to work together, meaning it's a dance. It's not an either or. Sometimes people fetishize the whole getting out of a fight or flight, which is, it's important to know how to get out, but you need sympathetic and parasympathetic for homeostasis. You need go and flow to function as a human being. But the body is actually built to, for instance, have a spike of fight or flight, a spike of adrenaline, a spike of getting something done, getting really activated. There's nothing wrong with that if you can de-escalate and come back down after. That's what the body is built for. And so very often, and that is what rewilding is in the true sense, in embodiment, is that you actually teach your system how to escalate and de-escalate willingly. That you teach your system to have enough muscle, so to speak, in the lower body, so you can easily de-escalate and you have resource there and you're not stuck in, up here, and you can bring it back down. So what are practices? Well, easy practices are all the things we tend to do naturally if we're given space. So, moving, dancing, hip circles, rolling on the ground with your dogs or children, unless the children are very stressful, or your dogs are very stressful. But, being on the ground, being in water, unstructured, what I call nonlinear movement, the ability to essentially go from a focused state to a kind of a flowing, relaxed rest state, not to be confused with what people sometimes call a flow state of high creativity, and because a flow state of high creativity is both. It's intense go and intense flow channeled. What I'm talking about is flowing, as in going from one thing to the other, not so structured, not so linear. But it's always in the contrast that the magic happens. You have to be able to be linear, to be nonlinear. The problem is just that most people are so linear for so much, including their exercise patterns, their movement patterns, their structure around self-care, that they're very weak in the nonlinear, being a bit bored, like not spending every second of every day fully engaged in a schedule, laying on the ground looking up, laying on the ground looking down. Things of that nature, very simple things.
Mm.
Things like you come from a Nordic country, you know how good it is to, let's say, go in the sauna and then go into cold water and then, move around and loosen up your body and scrub your skin. And all of those are things that immediately activate the body's self-healing and kind of regulation functions. And it can't be said enough about that. Now, of course, not everybody can do a sauna, but you can do a hot shower or a bath or, go for a swim or things like that, where it's simple things. And I've developed an entire system of super simple practices, all of which are in the back end of the Wild Woman's Way. And they're good for men and women alike. Just had to start somewhere. So I started with women, being one that was the obvious first choice. But as the whole third part of the book is super simple embodiment practices of all kinds, for pleasure, for intuition, for, kind of sexual awakening, stress relief. It's all in there.
And I've heard you mention that it's common that a lot of trauma sort of ends up or gets stuck in our lower parts of the body. Could you elaborate a bit on that? Like, why is it that a lot of trauma tends to get stuck in the lower parts of our body? Why isn't it that it ends up in the whole system? Or does it? What's your perspective on that?
It can end up in the whole system. There's all kinds of theories why it ends up more in other places. The way I've worked with it, because I used to work in a treatment center where people had very, very severe trauma. And so I could kind of map where things would go. So there's two things that can happen. It's worth talking about both of them. So in general, because trauma happens physically, emotionally, mentally, right? There's a conglomerate of things that happen in a traumatic situation. Let's do something very simple, like I don't know, you fall. I recently, not recently, but a while ago, fell off my horse, right? And so when you fell off my horse, and so as I fell off my horse, as I was still falling, right, my mind went like, oh shit, if I break something, right? And so in the context of, oh shit, if I break something, that's let's say, emotional, mental clench that then hits, the area where I fell, meaning it congeals in the area where I fell. So the moment I fell on my right shoulder. And I had fallen off the horse on my right shoulder before as a kid. That's always how I fell off the horse. Front right. So so, you know, I kind of tucked and I rolled and then I laid there and I was like, oh shit, am I okay? Right. So then of course everything kicks in, the adrenaline and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So what would happen in a moment like that, if we would be able to pinpoint it, is that my emotional distress, my fear, my, you know, kind of my mental fear, my emotional distress, and the impact kind of, you know, tighten together. And if I do have an existing injury in that area, then all of that attaches on the existing injury. If I don't have an existing injury there, it just all attaches in that area. Now maybe I'll bruise my shoulder or whatever. Now I'm like having my shoulder forward. Now that creates an entire posture situation. Somewhere in the fascia and the nerves and everything, that information gets locked. So then now I could undo that, and I could undo that with physical therapy, and I took some arnica immediately once I crawled upright and realized nothing had really happened. Immediately got some arnica, immediately did some movement, and I iced it and I heated it, right? So you can do things to get that out. And if you do it immediately, if you have the luxury, because sometimes you don't, right? If you're end up in the hospital, or it's of an emotional nature, or it's of an abusive nature, whatever. But if you can treat it, you can work that contraction and the clench and the actual tightness out. And as you do that, you'll notice that there's an emotional component to that. Now, of course, many of us have acquired many of these things in not so simple ways. And so we have areas of, let's say, coping shapes that over time attach more, either more of the same or even bring on more of the same. You know, there's all kinds of really interesting things that happen because it's a physical, emotional, and mental kind of clenching. And there's information that's stored in the body, information stored emotionally, information stored mentally. So that can happen anywhere in the body, you know, and particularly if you have old injuries, that can really happen as well. So, but now why the pelvic floor? The pelvic floor is an area that has a lot of this. As you probably know, there's all these things that look a little bit like hammocks, you know, muscle layers that look like hammocks, and they hang from different bones via ligaments and all of that. So there's all this very intricate tissue with a lot of fascia in between. And so that area can store a lot. There's also a lot of, you know, action there. But when we have any kind of existential moments of, you know, stress or crisis or trauma, or even, you know, just when we get too much in our head, we kind of pull up the pelvic floor to squeeze the energy up. And if you go, right, you can notice in that how everything pulls up. And so that habitual pulling up, which happens for a lot of people, that habitual pulling up creates patterns of tension, and eventually they become chronic tension patterns. And a lot of people have massive amounts of chronic tension in the pelvic floor. And that's just now the way it is, right? And then there's something else that most people don't know about, which is something I can't say enough about, which I didn't know about either, is most people are magnesium deficient. And if you're magnesium deficient, like they say, I mean, in the States, it's probably better in Europe, but like 85% of people are magnesium deficient. And if you're magnesium deficient and you happen to have periods where, you know, that then fluctuates even more, and it hangs with the thyroid and the calcium and all of that, your pelvic floor can get so tight. Well, and magnesium is one of those things that you can't just take a pill. It doesn't do it. You have to take it liquid or transdermal. So I can't say enough about having baths with a lot of magnesium flake, you know, magnesium salts in it for pelvic health. That's just a side note. But Then, of course, there's a whole theory that a lot of the, let's say, emotional, sexual relational stuff attaches in the part of the pelvic floor, in the part around the cervix, simply because that's, it's a vortex of energetically as well as physically. And so then we end up with all kinds of numbness and tension and clench in those areas. And it's not that easy to release them, because even if you release them regularly, they will come back, right? Because there's patterns there and everything. So it's worth really engaging with the pelvic floor and really engaging with understanding the pelvic floor and all of those things as a means of keeping the area healthy and well.
Mm. And one of the things that I've noticed a lot of people mentioning while like experiencing these sort of embodied practices is that since there's so much trauma stored in our bodies, also these sort of strong emotions tend to come up while doing these practices. And I know we're kind of short on time now, but I would like to hear if you have any like last advices for people who are might be afraid of like of turning towards these practices in order for them to like the fear of like what might come up, and like how can we hold ourselves in these moments when these emotions are being released, which is so beautiful when it happens, but we also sort of need these tools to hold ourselves.
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of the great misconceptions, right? And people think that embodiment should feel good, but it typically doesn't always feel good, because what it is when you listen to the messages of the body, whatever the body has to say will happen first. And very often that is suppressed tension or stress or trauma or overwhelm. And when we allow ourselves to feel that, it's pretty unpleasant to begin with. Very often, people, when they relax or they do something relaxing, they feel worse after, because they can suddenly feel the tension in their neck or feel the tension in their jaw. And like, oh, I felt much better before this massage, right? And yeah, because suddenly you can hear what the body's been saying all along. So embodiment is essentially not always pleasant, but what speaks for it is essentially that when you engage with it, those first layers wash off, and then you have a true connection to your vitality and your intuition. So the key is little and often. So the key is to not just go to some workshop or do the thing for an hour, right? And then not even know what's up and down. The key is to start doing a minute under the shower, do some hip circles or move your body in, just weird ways while you're like having a shower or brushing your teeth or waiting for the bus subtly. The key is to kind of enter into that conversation with yourself about embodiment very, very gently, and do very little, but often. There's no excuse to not wiggle your body around in the shower or wiggle your body around while brushing your teeth. And if you do, a minute in the shower and a minute brushing your teeth, or two if you're proper with your tooth brushing, and then you do the same in the evening, you've done 4 minutes a day. Well, it doesn't sound like much, but it really adds up. And those kind of pattern builders are essentially accumulative. It's like this exponential curve of actually building capacity and building connection.
Beautiful. Oh, thank you, Michaela, for sharing all this wisdom and these perspectives with us today. It's such a pleasure to have you here, and I noticed that the time is running up, so I would love to hear from you as a sort of wrap up for this conversation. If you would be able to reach the whole world for just 30 seconds, what is something that you would like to share with them, say to them, or maybe even do with them for 30 seconds? Everyone is listening.
Well, for 30 seconds, it would definitely be moving the body in a very non-linear joyous, fun way, right? Just shaking, wiggling, hopping, moving. That would be my 30 seconds, absolutely.
Love
And
it.
that I think is always good for anyone, anywhere, for many, many reasons.
Mm, thank you. And for the listeners who would like to get in touch with you or to dive into your work deeper, where can they find you and your work?
Well, I'm assuming you'll post my website, right?
Yes, I will put everything in the links.
michaelaboehm.com,
Yeah.
in the links, and that's where you can find everything. There's lots of free resources. There's actually there's like a little pop-up with a quiz about embodiment. And then that once you get like into that, line up with the email, you get 8 guided practices.
Mm.
And some education. I filmed this entire sequence, and then at the end of the 8 emails, you actually get that as like a little free mini course. So that's an easy, free way to engage with practices that doesn't cost anything. My podcast, of course, is a free resource. There's a whole other realm of free information in the nonlinear movement section. I've just created a deck of oracle cards that are all about embodiment of 55 flavors of the feminine.
Wow.
It's really, let me see if I have one here. It's
Yes.
like I did it over the summer, and it's just here.
Ah, wow. Oh my
Yes,
God.
yes,
55
they're
flavors. Love it.
I wrote the descriptions, and then I did
Mm,
text to image rendering.
wow.
uh
Is it like the
1400.
different archetypes of women
It's
or
different flavors.
ah,
It's all kinds of like wild and wonderful stuff. Yeah.
wow.
So these are flavors. They're like spices.
So you're
Um,
supposed to like pick a card and then move
you
in
pick it.
whatever.
You
Yeah.
can use it as an oracle.
Mm.
This is one of my favorites,
Oh,
and
wow.
then this is one of my favorites.
Ah,
Um,
yes.
yes, so they're of all ages and orientations and
Mm,
ideas, and I mean, there's like some really cool. This is
I
the
love it.
wisdom card. So these are meant to be resonated with. So they're
Mm,
practice cards essentially to widen one's capacity, and to learn different flavors, which is very useful, both from a sexual perspective, because the more flavors you can um, express, the more exciting the interaction gets, but also from a heart and compassion perspective, and an understanding of different flavors, different ages, different orientations. So that's what it was meant to be. Here, this is one that you will maybe
ah.
enjoy.
Oh, wow. Yes, I love it. And for everyone who is listening, who isn't watching
Oh, seeing
this
it,
show,
yes.
I want to encourage everyone to
It's
check it up on
it's
your
a
website.
wise Viking shield
Yeah.
maiden that I'm
Yeah.
showing her.
So
Yes.
beautiful, powerful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So those are specifically meant as practice cards, but then for people who are not familiar with those practices so much, I'm giving instructions too, but I wrote a whole oracle with it. So each
Wow.
card has an oracle meaning as well, and that was great fun. So
Love
there's
it.
all kinds of fun stuff out there, and
Mm.
I think that's where I need to end it, because I
Yeah.
gotta go teach a class.
Thank you so much for giving us your time and your wisdom today. I'm so thankful.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for being here with us today, for showing up for the expansion of your own mind and your own heart in this space. If you enjoyed this conversation, I would love it if you took a moment to share this conversation on your story and tag me, so that we can keep the conversation going even after the end of this episode. And another way to support the show is to leave a review in the app where you're listening. I'm so looking forward to hear your reflections, your perspectives and insights after listening to this conversation. Once again, thank you for being here with us today.